When 32-year-old John Harden and his wife Vicky made the trip south from Jacksonville to the quaint community of Claremont, they could have never imagined it would be their first steps towards a bloody and violent end. On a warm spring night in 1975, John spotted his work truck catching fire in the driveway and ran outside to put it out. The fire, purposefully set, was little more than a ruse designed to draw the father of five into the open. Moments later, a shot rang out, and John fell dead in his driveway, the victim of a single shotgun blast. Investigators working the case quickly determined that the killer, who had also cut the phone lines to the home, had lain in wait in the bushes that night, seeking his perfect opportunity. The next morning, they recovered the murder weapon, an old and beaten-up 20-gauge shotgun that was untraceable. An odd weapon for an assassination, they thought, and if only they could find the owner, they might uncover the truth. For nearly 50 years, the case has remained unsolved, and John Harden has been swept up into the memoryless files of history. Bizarrely, it wouldn't be a break in the case or a confession that would bring John's name back into the headlines, but instead, rumors and stories spreading throughout the city of a haunted house and the murder victim who sought his own justice from beyond the grave. Sadly, the true terror of the last moments of John's life is often ignored in place of tales of phantom apparitions and haunted happenings. The truth of what happened that night, who was responsible, and why John was killed has never been determined, and while his case is certainly haunting, dead men tell no tales. This is Trace Evidence, episode 239, The Murder of John Harden. Welcome to Trace Evidence. I'm your host, Stephen Pacheco. In today's episode, we examine the mysterious ambush-style murder of 32-year-old John Harden in Claremont, Florida. Before jumping into the case, just a quick reminder that I will once again be representing Trace Evidence on Podcast Row at CrimeCon this year. CrimeCon takes place in Nashville, Tennessee on the weekend of May 31st through June 2nd. As always, I'm excited to meet and chat with all of you there. So if you're planning to attend and you haven't yet purchased your pass, use promo code TRACE to save 10%. That's crimecon.com, promo code TRACE. I'm really looking forward to seeing you there. John Harden was opening up a new chapter in his life. Newly married for the second time, and with a 9-month-old son and a new town to live in, things were looking up. Then, out of nowhere, an unknown assailant would close his book permanently. This is episode 239, The Murder of John Harden. John Warren Harden was born on Wednesday, January 20th, 1943 in Claremont, Lake County, Florida, to parents John Guy Jr. and Beulah Agnes Warren, then both 21 years of age respectively. According to public records and newspapers of the time, John Jr. and Beulah were married 9 months earlier, on Wednesday, April 15th, 1942. John's middle name, Warren, is a direct reference to his mother's maiden name. According to military records, John Jr. registered for the draft 2 months later, in early June. His registration forms list him as being a skilled laborer, working as a painter and in construction for Herbert Wolf's San Marco Contracting Company. Now, before moving on too quickly, if you've got any familiarity with this case, I should note that there's a lot of debate when it comes to John's official year of birth and the spelling of his last name, among other things. We'll tackle all of that a little bit later, and I'm sure you'll see what all the confusion is about. The newlyweds and new parents were living in Mineola, a small city in Lake County which, as of the 1940s, listed a population of less than 300 residents. The new family wouldn't stray too far from that area over the next few years, living at different times in both Groveland, 6 miles west of Mineola, and later Claremont, just south of Lake Mineola and less than 4 miles from the city proper. Much of this area had been little more than sprawling farmland with old Victorian-style homes dotting along the roadways every few miles. However, As the 1940s progressed, Lake County became an area high in citrus production, and by the end of the decade, it would quickly become the region's dominant industry. Officially being drafted into the Army, John's father was shipped over 100 miles north to Camp Blanding in Clay County, approximately 40 miles southwest from Jacksonville. John's father would be assigned to the Army Corps of Engineers, and for the next few years, little is known about the day-to-day experience of John and his family. What we do know is that the relationship between his parents was less than stellar, and within just a few years of their marriage, they weren't getting along anymore at all. On Thursday, July 25, 1946, when John was just 3 years old, his parents officially divorced, with each being listed as then living back in Lake County. Little is known of John's childhood, though some have reported that he didn't have it the easiest. With his parents split, he spent the majority of his time being raised by his mother. His father was involved in his life to some extent, though it appears that Beulah was the primary caregiver. John loved the outdoors, whether he was fishing, hiking, riding his bike, or just hanging out with friends. Family would later state that, even from a young age, John had a very lovable personality, and he cared deeply for friends and family. He would be described as the type who would always lend a helpful ear and a hand if necessary, wanting to ensure that those that mattered to him were safe, happy, and healthy. As a teenager, John would go on to attend Claremont High School, which, for some reason, would become a key identifying trait in all media coverage of this case, with John constantly referred to as a graduate of Claremont High School. It was within the school that John would meet a young woman who would forever change his life, Rita Mertens. The two would quickly become involved in a relationship, with Rita later referring to them as being high school sweethearts. The two became nearly inseparable, and it was apparent to everyone that knew them that this was more than just a teenage romance. When she appeared on Unsolved Mysteries to discuss the case, Rita stated that they fell in love in high school and moved forward from there together, though public records seem to tell somewhat of a different story. According to Florida marriage records, Rita married a man named Robert Costango in November of 1960. Approximately 9 months later, in early July of 61, she gave birth to a son, and 3 months after that, in October of 61, she and Costango divorced. 1 month later, on Saturday, November 4th, John and Rita were officially married in Halifax, North Carolina. It's interesting to view the official record versus the story that's been told over the years, but, as is often the case, real life is vastly more complex to simply be summed up in a succinct television interview. While this is all confusing, it should be noted that when the child born in July, 4 months before their wedding, went on to be named Timothy Paul Harden. Regardless by what road they ended up together, it remains apparent through interviews and photographs that John and Rita were very much in love. Following his alleged graduation from Claremont High School in the spring of 1960, John quickly followed again in his father's footsteps, enlisting in the military. On Wednesday, June 22nd, a then 17-year-old John enlisted in the Air Force to serve for 4 years. Now, there's been a lot of debate about John over the years with respect to two questions. What is the proper spelling of his last name, as multiple papers and historic records spell it either Harden, E-N, or Harden, I-N. The other question that has always been asked is whether John was born in 1942 or 1943, as multiple articles state that he was 32 years old in 1975, which would suggest a 43 birth. However, his grave marker, officially provided by the Air Force, lists his name as Harden and his birth year as 1942. The couple's marriage license clears up some of these questions, with John spelling his name on the form Harden and noting his age then as being 18, pinning down his birth year as 1943, not the 1942 that is listed on his tombstone, as he would have then been 19 in 1961. On the application, it's noted that John's name and age were both verified by his military identification card, which means that he spelled his name E-N, and he was 18 in 1961, which seems to confirm the 1943 birth date. In the interest of verification, I sent a form in to NARA, the National Archives and Records Administration, requesting a verification of John's service and vital statistics. If the marriage license is believed accurate, then his tombstone lists the wrong year for his birth, and that's an oversight which should be corrected. I'll let you know down the road when I hear back from NARA and what the results were of their own record search. By my research, it's rather confusing. The marriage license says he was born in 43. The Social Security Death Index also says 43. However, the Department of Veterans Affairs death file lists 1942, as does the official Florida Death Index. Not helping the fact is that outside of this John, there were 4 other men named John Harden, spelling it with an E, spelling it with an I, all living in Central and North Florida during this time, including his own father. So you can see how easily records from the 50s and 60s could be mixed up and tied together when there isn't necessarily any familial links between the different Johns. Another curious detail about this marriage license is that it lists both John and Rita as living in Jacksonville. Records show that following the divorce of his parents, John's mother Beulah moved to Jacksonville and remarried, obtaining the last name of Salas, and it seems that John went with her. There is no record of Rita ever attending Claremont High School, and frankly, there isn't one for John either. There is a John Harden listed in the Claremont yearbook for 1959. The problem is, he would have been 16 that year and definitely not a freshman as the person in the yearbook is listed. In addition to that, by the next year, the person in the photo has his name corrected to be Roddy Harden with an I. I did manage to find Rita in several Jacksonville area high school records, but not John. And so it appears to be one of 2 different situations. Either John met Rita in school in Jacksonville and then returned to Claremont and graduated there, never appearing in the yearbook even once, or he is not in fact a graduate of Claremont High School. As you can see, trying to figure out exactly what was going on here is cluttered by broken dates, misspelled names, people with the same names, and a lack of high school records to be found anywhere. Moving on, because I could dig through the archives and track genealogy all day, the couple's marriage license notes that they were wed in Halifax, North Carolina, 11 miles south of Roanoke Rapids, which at the time was home to the Roanoke Rapids Air Force Station, which operated as a general radar station and to which John was assigned for a period of time. During John's time in the Air Force, the couple were together and traveled to new bases when he was reassigned. Rita took on the role of homemaker and mother, raising Timothy, and over the course of the next few years, they lived as a military family lacking the certainty of solid ties to their community. It appears, whether by choice or as dictated by their way of life, the couple decided not to have more children while John was still in the service. On Sunday, January 21st, 1964, John's enlistment finally came to an end, and he left the Air Force with an honorable discharge, having obtained the rank of Airman Second Class. 3 years later, the Air Force would restructure some of its ranking, changing Airman Second Class to Airman First Class, though Second Class is what is still officially listed on John's grave marker. Exiting the Air Force, John and Rita returned to Florida, where they settled down in Duval County, in the suburbs of Jacksonville, which both viewed as their home. Over the course of the next years, the couple began expanding the family, having 3 more children, 2 girls, Lisa and Lori, and a boy, John Jr., between 1965 and 1971. John worked various jobs, but ultimately settled into working in what we would today call HVAC, with a focus on air conditioners, refrigerators, and the like. However, he also possessed skill and knowledge for the repair of different types of equipment and machinery. Being it fixing a broken oven or a furnace, he was skilled and knowledgeable. He earned a reputation as the guy you wanted to call should you have a mechanical issue, and he'd not only find a way to solve it, he'd do it without charging you an arm and a leg. Appearing on Unsolved Mysteries, Rita described John in glowing terms, at one point saying, quote, "Every moment with him was wonderful. He was a good person. He was always caring, not only about his family, but his friends, everybody. He was always concerned about everyone around him, everyone that touched his life." End quote. Unfortunately, while Rita was still very much in love with John, something was changing within him. While he continued to profess his love to his wife, he started to grow distant and seemed to be working longer hours than usual. Then one afternoon in the spring of 1973, after 13 years of marriage and 4 children, John told Rita they needed to have a serious conversation. She explained it, saying, quote, "He came in from work one afternoon, put his arms around me. He said, 'I love you. I have to get away.' He said, 'I have some problems. I'm going to get myself together. I'll be home.' But he never came home." End quote. John left the home the couple had shared for years, and in January of 1974, their divorce was officially finalized. What exactly John had needed to get away from, what problems he needed to work on, if any at all, is still unknown. Whether or not something had made a difference or if John was simply trying to break the news to Rita in the easiest way he could has never been confirmed. While many have looked at the divorce and viewed it as John just trying to get out with the least amount of drama, it's difficult to ignore that just 15 months later, he'd be drawn into an ambush and shot to death in his own driveway. Unsurprisingly, it wasn't long after John left the family home and set out on his own that he turned up engaged to a young woman and expecting another child. One of the people associated with this case that we know the least about is John's second wife, a woman by the name of Victoria Mango. Now, many articles about this case suggest, between the lines, that Vicky might not have been old enough to have a relationship with John when they first got together, and he's often been represented as robbing the cradle by marrying a woman who is often referred to as barely 20. While 10 years younger than her new husband, Vicky was born in August of 52, which means that she was at least 21 years old when John left his wife and 22 by the time they were married. There's no denying that he seems to have left his wife and his children for a woman a decade younger than him, and while many may look down upon that behavior, it's hardly as sinister as it's often represented, but I digress. Now, Vicky has never spoken publicly about John, their relationship, or that fateful night in March of 1975. What we do know is that in late October, early November of 1973, just a few months after leaving Rita, John and Vicky were expecting their first child. On Tuesday, June 4th, 1974, Vicky gave birth to a son who they would name John Warren Harden Jr. The new parents lived in and around Jacksonville at the time, but they would be presented with a new opportunity. Following the passing of an older relative, Vicky was the recipient of that relative's home. The house, located at 386 West Osceola Street in Claremont, was a beautifully maintained Victorian house that had been built in 1881, 3 years before the town had even been drawn up and platted. The couple discussed the house and agreed that it didn't really make sense for them to keep it. They enjoyed where they were in Jacksonville, but they also thought it wouldn't be wise to leave the house empty until a buyer could be secured. Instead, John and Vicky decided to take their newborn son and move into the large old house to maintain and upkeep it until a sale went through. Together, they packed up what belongings they needed and made the 170-mile trip from northeastern Florida to Claremont, just west of Orlando. Both were taken not just with the beauty of the 2,000-square-foot home, with its red eaves, large, almost wraparound-style porch, and a driveway that led to a large parking area with quick access to the back door, but they were also drawn to the surroundings. John was more than familiar with the area, having lived previously in Claremont, and he loved how close the home was to Lake Mineola, clearly visible to the north and less than 1/10 of a mile from their front door to the shore. Once John and Vicky settled in, he set his mind to business. He'd left behind his clients and his other business in Jacksonville, so he'd need to start from the ground up. He went on to start a new company, naming it Mango Refrigeration, after his wife. He quickly took on new clients from local fruit-growing operations and restaurants. He even picked up contract work for the city of Claremont itself. Suffice it to say, John was doing good around Lake County, and maybe even better than he had been in Jacksonville. Part of that was due to conflicts he'd had back in Duval County regarding local unions. Reportedly, John often captured contracts that local unions went out for, and they had started applying pressure on him to back away from what they considered to be their territory. Never one to be backed into a corner or intimidated, John ignored the pressure, and when his lack of response led to threats, he finally confessed to his new wife that he was worried. Vicky would later tell investigators that John had said he thought several union members were, quote, out to get him. Regardless of his concern, John didn't stop grabbing up every job he could, whether the union was going for them or not. Down in Claremont, things were different, at least for a time. He was able to establish his business and pick up new contracts fairly quickly, and it took a few months for union members to take notice. When the local unions in Lake County began expressing their frustration with him bringing those same practices he'd been conducting in Jacksonville down to their area, John had reacted much the same as earlier. He ignored their demands that he acquiesced to the union. According to an article in the Orlando Sentinel, in late February of 1975, just weeks before the murder, John accepted several profitable contracts that took quite a bit of money and opportunity away from union members operating in the area, and they weren't too pleased about it. This leads us to the night of Saturday, March 22nd, and the enduring mystery of just what and who are responsible for making that John Warren Harden's last night on Earth. During the evening of Saturday the 22nd, the phone rang in the old Victorian house in Claremont. Vicky answered the call and then handed the receiver over to John, informing him that it was one of his clients who was having a problem. The man on the other end of the line was Ernest Basil Hart Jr., known locally as E.B. E.B. was the owner and proprietor of Wyatt's, Y-E-T-T-E-S, a local drive-in restaurant located at 350 East Broad Street in Groveland, just 6 miles west from the house at the corner of Osceola and 5th Street. After chatting with E.B. for several minutes, John agreed to come down to assist him as he was having problems with one of his main units. In 2006, a journalist from the Ledger got in touch with E.B. to find out what exactly had happened that night. He explained that the machine he used to fry chickens had broken down, and John had needed to bring a part to fix it for him. After hanging up the phone, John, Vicky, and their 9-month-old boy climbed into John's work truck and made the short drive to Wyatt's. For decades, people have debated why exactly John decided to bring the whole family along with him, and a lot of different answers have been proffered. Some theorize that with Vicky being a new mother and John having 4 children previously, that she didn't feel entirely comfortable staying home with the baby by herself at night. Others have suggested that the couple were extremely close, and if John were heading somewhere that night, of course he'd bring his wife and child along. It's also entirely possible that, with it being a restaurant, they decided to sit down and eat a late dinner while John worked in the kitchen. The truth is, without Vicky talking, we'll likely never know what exactly went down, but there were many who wondered if maybe this call had been made to lure John out of the house so his killer could get into position. At least when it comes to this theory, which is extremely prominent in coverage of this case, E.B. Hart denies that there was anything underhanded about his call. Asked whether or not it was a legitimate emergency that night, Hart told the Ledger, quote, "Oh yeah, it was legitimate, on my part at least. The next day, his wife came over and said he'd been killed." End quote. We don't know exactly what time John received the repair call, but police seem to have narrowed the timeline down to between 9 and 9:30, and the drive being labeled as 10 minutes. This means that John arrived at the restaurant between 9:45 and 10 p.m. While we can't say with absolute certainty what time they left, police were able to confirm that the family arrived back at their house at precisely 10:45 p.m. Less than an hour later, and John would be dead. The house is situated at an angle at the intersection of West Osceola and 5th Street, with the front doors facing southwest towards the intersection. The driveway of the home runs south to north, connecting to West Osceola just off the east side of the house. The driveway extends away from the road for approximately 80 feet before it widens out into a large paved area in which multiple vehicles could be parked, and there's a detached garage on the northeast corner. The back door to the home connects to an exterior staircase which leads directly to the paved parking area. According to investigators, when the family arrived home that night, John pulled his work truck into this parking area and parked within a few feet of those back stairs, leaving it facing towards the northwest. On either side of the back stairs were thick bushes, and it's believed that John's killer was hiding there, crouched down and watching as the family passed by, moving up the stairs and back into the home. After going inside, Vicky took the baby and put him down for the night, while John lumbered up to the second-floor bathroom, right next to the bedroom he and Vicky had chosen. According to the official timeline, John stepped out of the shower and began toweling himself off at 11:08 p.m. Walking from the bathroom to the bedroom with only a towel wrapped around his waist, his attention was drawn towards two windows facing east towards where he parked his truck. He saw his vehicle become engulfed in flames as a quickly growing fire started swallowing it up. Screaming out to his wife, John threw his towel down on the floor and ran as fast as he could, heading down the stairs, through the kitchen, and out the back door, in the nude. Quickly making his way down the back steps, the 32-year-old reached out for his truck but withdrew his hand from the sheer heat. Trying again, he got his fingers on the flap of an external compartment where he kept a fire extinguisher. Spraying at the fire, he couldn't make much of a dent in it. Turning back to his wife, he told Vicky to go inside, get him some clothes to throw on, grab their son, and get the hell out of the house. With the vehicle fire so close to the back porch, he was afraid the fire could spread to the home, and he wanted to make sure they were safe. Vicky turned and entered the home, proceeding back up the stairs and grabbing John Jr. Moments later, as she was making her way down the back stairs, she heard a large blast, or what she thought at the time was an explosion. Assuming the cause of the loud pop was the fire, she rushed out the door to check on John and found him lying on the pavement, bleeding from the chest. Squatting down beside him, she screamed, asking what happened. John was able to manage a whisper, saying only, "They shot me," before he slipped into unconsciousness, a series of wounds visible in his chest. Everything had happened so fast. From John exiting the shower at 11:08, police have him lying in the driveway after being shot between 2 and 3 minutes later at 11:10. Neighbors, drawn to the fire, emerged from their homes and started using their garden hoses in an attempt to get the flames under control. Multiple neighbors reported hearing the loud blast, but didn't witness what had happened, nor were they aware of John's condition until they heard Vicky screaming. Several neighbors called in the fire, and the Claremont Fire Department arrived rapidly, their station located less than half a mile from the home. John was loaded into an ambulance and transported to South Lake Memorial Hospital, a trip of less than 3 miles. Unfortunately, doctors were unable to save John, and his official time of death is noted as being at 11:25 p.m., approximately 15 minutes after he ran down the back stairs. Back at the scene of the crime, the fire department was able to easily put out the fire on John's work truck. Sergeant Mitchell Rogers, then of the Claremont Police Department, was one of the first investigators called to the scene and would later be joined by long-term police chief Prentice Tyndall. Given the late-night hour and the lack of lighting, investigators didn't want to ruin the crime scene, and so they decided to conduct a thorough search of the home and the property in the morning. They did, however, question neighbors who had come out to help fight the fire, and though they spoke with Vicky, it was reported by both police and journalists that she was not being the most cooperative. On the morning of Sunday, March 23rd, detectives and patrolmen were called to the property to begin searching for potential evidence. John's vehicle was towed off the property and would be examined by the deputy fire marshal to determine whether it had caught fire naturally or if it was a case of arson, as most of the police theorized. While some headed inside the home, others were charged with searching the property. The first thing investigators outside discovered was that someone, presumably the shooter, had cut the home's phone line. Since they knew John had received an emergency call, they were left to believe that the killer had likely cut the line sometime after the family left the home and headed towards the Groveland restaurant. Moving around to the back of the house, heading towards the north, they found a series of footprints leading into the bushes near the back steps and deep, heavy impressions where they believed the killer had likely squatted, concealing himself inside of the bush when the family made their way inside after returning home. At the time, there was a series of tall hedges running along the west side of the property in the backyard, and there, between two hedges, they found the murder weapon, identified at the scene as a single-barrel bolt-action 20-gauge shotgun. Investigators hoped that tracking the gun might lead them to the shooter, but there was one major problem. There was no serial number, suggesting the weapon had been manufactured prior to 1968, when the Federal Gun Control Act started requiring firearm companies to stamp serial numbers on every weapon crafted. Hoping they might get lucky with fingerprints, the weapon was bagged and shipped off to the Sanford Region 4 Crime Lab for processing and analysis. Additional searching of the property recovered another item described only as a men's jacket. This item was recovered from the front lawn, which led investigators to believe the killer may have ran from the spot of the shooting towards the southwest, crossing the front property. This trajectory could also have brought the killer towards Lake Mineola, and in part, this led to a theory that the killer may have made his escape by boat, crossing to the other side of the lake where a vehicle could have been waiting. At the same time, it was just as likely he'd run off to a getaway vehicle parked a block or two away. Directly south from the home, across West Osceola Street, was Keller Park, home to some tennis and shuffleboard courts. Detectives issued a statement in the media noting that they knew people were in the park between 9:30 and 11 p.m., and they might have seen or heard something that could assist in the investigation, and they might not even know it. Sergeant Mitchell Rogers in the Orlando Sentinel requested that anyone who had been in the area that night call the police department and give a statement, even if only to say that they didn't hear or see anything. While searchers outside of the home had found several items of interest, inside of the home was another story. According to investigators, nothing was found inside the house that appeared to be connected to the murder. On the other hand, they did recover a small amount of marijuana, which they seized. Chief Tyndall speculated that the finding of the drugs might have been a reason Vicky elected not to fully cooperate with them, though this doesn't make a great deal of sense unless police were pressing hard about the drugs, which at the time was described as being an amount consistent with personal use, not a dealer or a heavy user. Vicky's silence is just another one of the bizarre mysteries of this case. On this same Sunday, District Medical Examiner Dr. William H. Schutz conducted an autopsy on John. Dr. Schutz noted multiple wounds about the upper chest, neck, and face consistent with a shotgun blast. Schutz would ultimately determine that John had died rapidly due to the fact that one of the pellets had penetrated his heart. Given that a shell was utilized, it became apparent that John wasn't shot with a slug, but there was never any specificity given as to whether he was shot with smaller pellets, like utilized in birdshot, or if they were larger pellets consistent with buckshot. There have also never been any statements made about analysis of the pellet spread to try and determine how close the barrel of the gun may have been to John when it was fired. Given the position of his truck and the bushes on either side of the back stairs, if the killer had stayed hidden in the bushes for the shot, then it's a range of 15 to 20 feet. But if he took a few steps out and shot in the clear open, he could have fired from as close as 5 to 10 feet. The shotgun is one of the most valuable pieces of evidence in this case, and yet it's hardly discussed in the weeks after the murder. There has never been any information revealed, if known, about a manufacturer or what year it could have been made. In hopes of getting further assistance, Sergeant Rogers had a photograph of the gun printed in the Orlando Sentinel in May, 2 months after the murder. The image, which is grainy and fails to show the end of the barrel, does reveal key traits about the weapon that an expert would presumably recognize for identification purposes. Sergeant Rogers told the Sentinel that the gun was old and in poor condition, and they hoped someone might recognize it and be able to provide them with further information. That does not appear to have happened. While it may be a fruitless effort, I have posted the image on several forums where gun aficionados are often asked to identify old weapons. There have been no answers yet, but time will tell. If they still possess the weapon, they might do well to take new, more detailed photographs and release them now. On Tuesday, April 1st, a funeral was held for John by way of Kerfis Funeral Chapel. The graveside ceremony was conducted at 2 p.m. in Montverde Cemetery, 10 miles northeast from the house on West Osceola. He was laid to rest beneath a military-issued marker which reads John W. Harden, spelled E-N. Airman, 2nd Class, U.S. Air Force. It lists his date of birth as January 20th, 1942, which may be off by a year, and his date of death as March 22nd, 1975. There were no obituaries posted for John, nor have there been any statements made on the record from anyone in the family, or if there were, they have long since been lost to time. Within a few months of John's funeral, the case was hitting dead ends, and investigators talked of it growing cold. There were some leads, and they may have been pursued, but they weren't exactly getting what they needed out of it. The deputy fire marshal would confirm to detectives that John's truck fire was certainly arson, as he found evidence that gasoline had been poured on the truck to get the fire started. Detectives had previously theorized that the fire had been purposefully lit to lure John out of the home and into the line of fire. The phone line having been cut, presumably to limit the chances of contacting police or fire and rescue. Sergeant Rogers, along with others, spoke publicly about their belief that John had been ambushed, for lack of a better term. What they couldn't figure out was who would have a reason to want to kill him. In mid-May of 1975, Sergeant Rogers told the Sentinel that they had interviewed over 100 people to that time, including folks from both Claremont and Jacksonville. Everyone they spoke with talked highly of John and claimed they couldn't think of any reason someone might want to harm him, describing him as friendly and a kind-hearted man. In hopes of covering more ground, the Claremont Police Department received investigative assistance from the State Department of Criminal Law Enforcement, as well as the Lake County Sheriff's Office. While no one suggested an outright reason for John's murder, there may have been some hints. According to Rogers, at least one source told investigators that John had been under serious pressure from labor unions up in Jacksonville, and this may have played a role in why he was so eager to stay at the home in Claremont for a while. Rogers noted a labor union issue could have played a role in the murder, but they would need more evidence before they could come to any conclusions. Detective Jerry Blair, who would work the case several years later, believed there certainly could have been a connection between John's murder and the disputes he was having with the labor unions. That time in Central Florida was a violent one for unrest amongst the unions. The detective noted that not long before the murder, someone had set 26 vehicles on fire at a plumbing company 30 miles outside of Claremont, and that there was a union-related bombing at a sand company in Ocoee, just 15 miles east. In February of 75, a month and a half prior to the murder, 3 members of the Plumbers and Steamfitters Local 803 were convicted of charges in relation to what prosecutors had described as a 4-year industrial sabotage campaign. State witnesses testified to knowledge of a massive campaign of vandalism, arson, bombings, and shootings on non-union job sites in 3 separate counties. William Beck, business manager for the union, was convicted on 1 count of conspiracy and 2 counts of possessing illegal bombs. Daniel Evans, union organizer and business agent, was also found guilty of conspiracy. Local member George McFadden was convicted of conspiracy and possession of unregistered explosives. Benjamin Haynes, a self-confessed saboteur, was the star witness and testified that Beck had hired him in 1969 to wage war against non-union plumbing contractors and businesses. Haynes admitted to carrying out several crimes at Beck's order, including but not limited to attacks, bombings, and fires at Seminole Junior College, the Sheridan Catalina Inn, a service station construction site, and several smaller construction sites. He even acknowledged the 1973 aborted plan to bomb the car of the president of Airflow Designs, a non-union air conditioning firm. Perhaps largest in the charges was Haynes' admission that Beck commissioned the firebombing of an Orlando Utilities Commission water purification plant in December of 1970, as well as the dynamite bombings of a carpenter's union hall on Oak Ridge Road in March of 70. Suffice it to say, it doesn't sound like these wars with union members were anything less than violent and deadly, and John Harden may have walked himself right into the line of fire without thinking twice. This case is just one example of dozens that can be found around this time. Unable to make solid links between any union or union members and John's murder, investigators continued to pursue additional leads. According to Sergeant Rogers, while initially uncooperative, Vicky had moved back to Jacksonville, refusing to spend another night in the home where her husband had been killed. However, she did return to Claremont multiple times to speak with investigators and to try to help their investigation. Detectives found the situation strange when they tracked down and spoke with people who were reported to be friends with John. They found that people had been trying to distance themselves from the murder victim, telling people that while they knew him, it was only at the level of an acquaintance or less. This was odd, since several of these people had come down to Claremont from Jacksonville and spent the weekend with John and Vicky, which seems more like the activity of close friends. In addition to the distance, Detective Blair noted that several of the men gave conflicting information about where they were and who they had been with in the hours leading up to the murder. Detective Blair explained, quote, "Their recollections were all vague. 4 or 5 of them were supposed to be together the night before he was killed, but none of them could remember which ones were with the others." End quote. Reportedly, when they asked around, investigators were told that John may have had some connections to the underground, or what we would refer to today as illegal activities. They would later state witnesses had claimed that John was involved in drug trafficking at some level, but they were never able to provide any actual proof. While marijuana had been found in the home, it was hardly what they'd expect to see if John were involved with drugs to some degree, but this would become another blind alley for detectives. It might help explain the murder. It would hardly be the first time someone was killed over drugs, but again, there were no links, no names, and nowhere to really focus that aspect of the investigation. There was something strange, though, which some believe could be connected to drug trafficking. According to multiple people interviewed by police, after John and Vicky moved into Claremont and he started Mango Refrigeration, he began introducing himself to people as John Mango, taking his wife's last name. While it's certainly possible he did this to create an alias for illegal activities, others have noted he could also have been trying to hide his identity from local unions who might be in communication with unions back in Jacksonville. It's quite obviously an attempt to conceal his identity, but whether for a crime or safety, no one can say for certain, and those who knew John have elected not to give any details of what they think could have happened. By July of 1975, the case had grown exceedingly cold, and investigators reported in local papers that their leads had come to an end and they weren't sure how much further they could take it. Utilizing multiple agencies, the investigation had spanned several counties across the state of Florida and it even veered north into Georgia. Special Agent Bruce McMahon of the Florida Department of Law Enforcement expressed his and other investigators' frustrations with the case when he spoke to Unsolved Mysteries. He explained, quote, "We had absolutely nothing after 3.5 months of a great deal of travel and interviewing, literally hundreds of witnesses. We didn't have any more at the end of 3.5 months than we did when we started. On a scale of 1 to 10 of difficulty of solving a crime, this is probably as close to a 10 as I've ever seen." End quote. In 1980, Detective Blair discussed the case several times with local papers. The 5-year anniversary of Claremont's only unsolved homicide drew in reporters and cover stories as macabre anniversaries often do. Asked his thoughts on the case, Blair was quick to agree with the original investigators that this had been a setup. He explained, quote, "It was a planned execution, no doubt. Buck naked, he ran outside. Who knows? They may have set fire to the house or come in after him if he hadn't come out." End quote. Blair acknowledged that the case was cold and that he looked through the files when he had free time. Sergeant Rogers, who had worked the original investigation, was still with the department operating as a night supervisor. Blair and Rogers would sometimes discuss the case together, and while he continued pursuing leads when he could, Blair could never find the shooter or the motive. The absence of a motive was really something that stagnated the case, with Chief Tyndall later noting, quote, "Had there been a motive, we could have proceeded with the case investigation a lot better. There was several things that were brought to our attention, but there was never a firm motive established." End quote. For the most part, the case file found its way into a filing cabinet, and remained there throughout the totality of the 1980s. Life moved on in Claremont. The house sold to a new family in the months following the murder, and over the years, it would change hands several times. Strangely, it wouldn't be the sense of injustice and the desire for answers that would bring John's case back into the spotlight, but instead, his story came back into the headlines because of tales of premonitions and dreams and the alleged haunting of his former home. In 1991, John's former home was owned by Donna and Ken Hatley, who claimed to have experienced strange phenomena, from doors opening by themselves to the ghostly apparition of a man and cold spots. Ken Hatley, who worked in the entertainment business, ended up speaking with an Unsolved Mysteries producer, and she was so taken by the story that she successfully pitched an episode which would predominantly cover the haunting while kind of touching on John's murder. The narrative almost wrote itself. House haunted by former homeowner shot and killed in unsolved homicide. The problem was, almost none of this story made sense. June Farris of Richmond, Virginia, told a story about how she'd been having repeating dreams of traveling down a staircase, passing through a kitchen, and exiting out a back door in a home she'd never been in before. Later, while in Florida and looking for a new home, she came upon the old Victorian house on West Osceola Street, and as she and a friend were allowed to take a look inside, she found herself hauntingly familiar with the stairs. She proceeded down and found herself in a kitchen leading to the back steps. It was the very path she'd taken in her dreams, and when she learned of John's murder, she believed there had to be a connection, as her dream followed the same path he had run to try and put out the fire in his truck. Of course, there's a few problems with June's story, even if you ignore the fact that it was all based upon a series of alleged dreams. Firstly, June acknowledged she first had these dreams in 1968, 7 years before the murder and 6 before John moved into the home. On top of that, when she did her tour through the house and felt that deja vu on the stairs and in the kitchen, it was 1972, 3 years before the murder. She stated on Unsolved Mysteries that she felt like maybe the dreams were telling her that it was up to her to solve the murder, but it's not like she hung around in 1972 or kept a close eye on the house. Instead, 6 years later in June of 1978, she bought the home and moved in with her family. They'd lived there throughout much of the 1980s, and they would tell stories about seeing ghosts, objects moving on their own, and the apparition they believed to be John Harden. Of course, this goes on to become a local story, and there's countless articles written about the haunted house and the ghost of John Harden. The problem is, they're so full of inaccuracies, misinformation, and straight-up fiction that it's difficult to trust any of what you read. Multiple articles say the ghost appears as a man dressed in jeans and a denim shirt, the very outfit John wore the day he was killed. Except he wasn't wearing anything when he was killed. He ran out of the house in the nude, having just finished his shower. In the episode, they note that the ghost often appeared in front of children, and John's first wife, Rita, appears to discuss the possibilities. She confirms that John was very protective of their own children and often checked on them, which is apparently enough evidence to not only confirm the existence of ghosts, but that this ghost has to be John Harden. Maybe he threw clothes on in the afterlife so as not to make his specter too disturbing? I joke, but honestly, this whole segment is cringe. A man is murdered. They never solve it. And instead of doing a deep dive into his life and murder, they talk about it for 5 minutes and spend the rest of the time chasing an alleged ghost who apparently likes annoying people by messing with their boat and making sounds like a music box. Either way, when the Hatleys take over the house, they claim to experience the same haunting issues that the Farrises had during their time. The Hatleys agree to let Unsolved Mysteries film in the house and on the property, where they did reenactments of the alleged haunting, as well as John's murder in 1975. Hell, in the episode, Robert Stack himself even claims the film crew experienced unexplained things like flashing lights. Police had hoped the coverage on the show would bring in calls and tips, but they didn't get anything and were mostly disappointed. Chief Tyndall later noted, quote, "That turned out to be a ghost story, and it didn't help us at all." End quote. Filmed in early 1991, The segment on John's so-called ghost aired on October 30th of that year for a Halloween special, and was the first time I learned of the case. While I don't think the ghost story helps much, at least it did bring John's name into the spotlight, even if for a limited time and having him playing second fiddle to a ghost in a Canadian tuxedo. The Hatleys would go on to contact the Center for Paranormal Studies in Gainesville, who examined the house and appeared to confirm the haunting, though not the identity of the alleged ghost. The couple would later discover that drawing attention to the so-called haunted house resulted in a lot of negative attention. Every Halloween, they would be flooded with local kids and curious parents who wanted to get a glimpse of the ghost themselves. They had strangers photographing their home, and on more than one occasion, people would just walk right in, uninvited. Years after the episode aired, Donna stated that she believed the ghost was gone and she hadn't had any experiences in years. Ken, for his part, still claimed there might be something there, but he theorized it was the spirit of the man who built the home and it had nothing to do with John Harden. He claimed that the ghost gave off a peaceful and comforting vibe, which is probably not what you'd expect from the victim of a brutal murder. They would eventually sell the house, and in the years since, while it remains a hallmark of ghost stories in Central Florida, there have been zero reported incidents of ghosts or unexplained phenomena in decades. I honestly didn't even want to address this ghost aspect, but in the interest of thoroughness, there you go. In 1998, Chief Tyndall officially retired and proclaimed that his department's inability to solve John's murder was the one dark cloud hanging over his illustrious career as one of the longest-serving police chiefs in Florida law enforcement history. He noted that they could have easily solved the case if the people who knew the truth would have spoken up, but they could never get them to budge. He went on to state that knowing who committed a crime and proving it are two different things, and he wasn't interested in expanding on his own theory of who the killer was. The case once again grew cold and was put back into a filing cabinet by the mid-90s. The last news on this case occurred in February of 2007, nearly 32 years after the murder and just over 17 years before today. Lieutenant Eric Jensen of the Claremont Police Department reported that they were reopening the investigation. While noting that they had no new evidence, they specified that the case was part of a cold case review between them, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, and the Lake County Sheriff's Office. What, if anything new was learned, has never been revealed, and the name of John Harden, regardless of how you spell it, only appears in more recent coverage as the aging reference to an old ghost story that settled into nothingness long ago. At the time of his murder, John Warren Harden was 32 years old and a father of 5. He was twice married and once divorced, though even after the separation and years after his murder, John's first wife Rita still spoke of him in glowing terms, describing him as a wonderful man who was taken too soon in a flash of needless violence. To date, investigators have never named a suspect nor a person of interest. They haven't discussed further details of the murder, shown new photos of evidence, including the murder weapon, which maybe they don't have anymore. I'll be posting the photo of the shotgun online, so if you think you can identify it, please don't hesitate to reach out. Somewhere, someone holds the answers to this mystery. Was John murdered in a random act of violence? Was he targeted by violent union members angry about his business practices? Could he have been connected to drugs and that led to his murder? Or could the answer lie closer to home, maybe with someone he knew and trusted? Investigators believe there are people out there who know the truth, who all these years later continue to keep that information to themselves. Do they do it out of fear or to keep themselves out of prison? John Harden has lain in his grave for 49 years now, while his killer was free to walk the earth and live life on their own terms. It's certainly well past time for the truth to be revealed. The murder of John Harden is a case that's been stuck in my mind for, well, more than 2/3 of my life. I distinctly remember watching this episode as a child, and while I don't remember everything I watched back then, this case stood out to me for one very solid reason. I was 8 years old, and it scared the hell out of me. In the ghost reenactment, there's a scene where the so-called ghost walks into a child's bedroom and stands at the end of his bed, leading the child to wake up and start screaming. I couldn't sleep with my bedroom door open for years after that, and I'm not kidding. Watching the episode now, it comes across with that same corniness/unsettling vibe that's true of almost all episodes of Unsolved Mysteries, but as a kid, it seemed real to me. I suppose that's not the best way to start out researching an episode, by remembering the bedroom ghost that haunted my youth, but it did keep John's name in my mind. I always felt a sadness about him, like this poor guy got killed for seemingly no reason, and then, rather than memorials and tributes, he's depicted as this grungy guy wandering around in jeans and a denim shirt as a ghost at the house where he was killed. Of course, growing older, I wanted to learn more. I've dug into the case a few times over the years, but often hit dead ends and get lost in the chaos of public records. This episode should have been out a few days ago, but I struggled to get through what information I had, and then confirming what I had was a nightmare. As I mentioned during the evidence section, there's a lot of confusion over the spelling of John's last name, the date of his birth, where he went to high school, and what he was up to when he wasn't working or at home. When it comes to the spelling of his last name, he seems to have confirmed it was E-N and not I-N, but I can tell you from tracking other members of his family, the two spellings appear interchangeable depending on what document you're examining. Even his ex-wife Rita has the E-N spelling of the name on her tombstone. But then there's the 4 other John Hardens in the area. There's Roddy, who is listed as John in one yearbook, but not the others. I couldn't find a single mention of John or Rita in any of the Claremont High School yearbooks I examined, but it did find mentions in Jacksonville. Even if you do manage to suss out the right John Harden, what you'll find is that there isn't a ton of information, not about his life, and certainly not about the murder. Strangely, while his ex-wife Rita was more than happy to sit down with Unsolved Mysteries and give a little insight into the case, his wife at the time of his death, Vicky Mango, was present for the tapings, but chose not to go on camera to discuss John or the case. A lot of people have wondered for all these years why she's been so tight-lipped about it. Her silence has led to a lot of speculation, but in fairness, this is a case rife with it, and no one's been able to be safe from these accusations, baseless as they may be. There's a few different theories on what might have happened here, and we're going to work our way through them. We'll start with some of the more fringe thoughts and then zero in as we go along. Despite the beautiful and heartwarming way in which Rita discussed her former husband, there are those who have wondered if she might not be responsible for the murder. In the spring of '73, after 13 years of marriage and 4 children, John abruptly explained to her that he had problems, needed time, and he was leaving. She assumed it was temporary, but when she received divorce papers, she knew her marriage was over. The divorce was officially finalized in January of '74, 15 months before the murder. Some have theorized that perhaps Rita, learning that John had remarried a woman 10 years his junior, who was then pregnant with his next son, might have felt a little angry, to say the least. Feeling abandoned and traded in for a younger model, might she have wanted to seek out some type of revenge? Surely it's not something you can just dismiss out of hand, but it seems a bit odd. It's suggesting that she was so hurt and angry that she lashed out. But killing your ex-husband a year and a half after the divorce and nearly 2 years after he left doesn't exactly seem like lashing out or a crime of passion. If she had wanted revenge, John and Vicky lived in the Jacksonville area for nearly a year before moving to Claremont, and Rita lived in Jacksonville with the kids, so it seems odd that she would wait until he moved nearly 200 miles away. Beyond that, Rita went on to live the rest of her life, remarrying and taking care of her children. She passed away in November of 2011 at the age of 68. Reading the tributes left to her, it's apparent that she was a loving and kind woman who touched many lives. She has no violence in her past, no arrest record, nothing to suggest that she could have ever turned a gun on her ex-husband, the father of her children. She went out of her way to appear on Unsolved Mysteries to try and give some insight into who John was, and throughout all of it, she came across as genuine, sincere, and frankly, sounding like she was still in love with the man who had left her all those years before. Police have never considered Rita a suspect, and while she did speak to investigators after the murder, they never thought she had any involvement. But Rita isn't the only member of John's first family to get caught up in rumors and speculation. There are also some who have tentatively pointed a finger towards John and Rita's son, Timothy Paul Harden. Now, the only reason anyone has suggested anything about Tim is because of his own tragic death. Tim passed away on Sunday, November 3rd, 1991, 5 days after the Unsolved Mysteries segment about his father first aired. Despite searching everywhere, I couldn't find any solid data on what led to his death other than a post from a sibling in which they said they were surprised and he had died suddenly. I don't know if this means an accident, some kind of a fall or injury, or something more akin to harming himself. Despite the absence of information here, a lot of people have decided that Tim watched the episode and then took his own life because he carried guilt about murdering his own father. It's certainly an attention-grabbing theory, no doubt, but it doesn't survive anything beyond a cursory glance. Tim was born in July of '61, which means that at the time of the murder, he was 13. Not only was he 13, but he lived with his mother in Jacksonville, 170 miles away. Those who consider this theory have never explained how he made the trip to Claremont, committed the murder, made the trip home, and nobody noticed. They don't have any answers as to why when the police found the killer's footprints in the bushes, they didn't describe them as smaller sized or those of a teenager. They can't explain where he got the gun or even why he would kill his father. If John left Rita in the spring of '73, then Tim was 11 at the time. All of a sudden, 2 years later, he wants to kill his father? I mean, I guess it's possible, but it's extremely improbable. Also, maybe it's just me, but I find it hard to believe a 13-year-old would have the wherewithal and foresight to cut the phone line and set the fire to lure John outside. Not to mention, John cries out to his wife, "They shot me." I'd imagine he might have specified if he recognized his killer as his own son, but maybe not. For the people who come up with theories like this, they never take into account any details that contradict the theory. They don't consider the possibility that Tim, 30 years old at the time of his death, might have had a rough life. His parents split when he was a teen. His biological father was murdered a few years later. That's a lot of trauma to put on someone who isn't an adult yet. Hell, it's a lot of trauma for someone who is an adult. Maybe he had some issues, maybe he was struggling, and maybe seeing that episode hit him hard. Or maybe he didn't watch it at all. Remember, his mother was in the episode, so it seems like he'd have had to have known something about it before it came out. Again, though, we don't know what happened. It could have been related to self-harm, but that doesn't mean he was connected to the murder at all. Maybe he missed his father. Maybe he was heartbroken by reliving the grief, or maybe it was something entirely unrelated. I didn't really want to discuss this theory. Well, I think it's stupid as shit, but I figured if I didn't, then someone would have eventually mentioned it and complained to me about it. Moving away from his first family, some have wondered if maybe his wife at the time of his death, Vicky, could have been involved. They point out the fact that she wasn't very cooperative in the beginning and hasn't said much about the case to this day. And while I agree that's enough to wonder, it sure is a hell of a leap to her being involved. From the evidence collected and the statements from neighbors and witnesses, it doesn't sound like Vicky herself could have been the shooter. So then you'd have to figure maybe she was in on some plan to have her husband killed. That's not a unique crime and it's happened before, so you can't really rule it out. The spouse is always going to be one of the first people you look at. The problem is, nothing comes up after that. Police never talk negatively about Vicky. They don't say she's behaving oddly or they find her suspicious. I think in the chaos of all this, it gets forgotten that at the time of the murder, she was 22, 23 years old? I can't imagine that it must have been easy to live through something like that, and if she came out on the other side and things weren't all roses, I wouldn't be surprised. While initial reports say she didn't cooperate, it's later noted that she moved back to Jacksonville but returned to Claremont multiple times to talk to the police. So it kind of sounds like she did cooperate, maybe just not that first night. Who knows? Maybe she was in shock, or maybe she had something to hide. The problem is, again, there's no evidence here. Sure, it's a fine theory, I suppose, but there's nothing to back it up. We don't know what their marriage was like, if they had problems, if John might have been stepping out on her, if she had someone else in mind, if they weren't getting along after having a kid and getting married so fast. They could have been a happy couple, or they could have hated each other. Although I'd find it odd that John would want to bring her with him on the job that night if they didn't get along very well. I could be wrong, but based on what I've read, it feels like Vicky was younger, maybe a little shy, and was just overwhelmed by the whole situation. One area they could have had a conflict over was the house. It had been left to Vicky, and they planned to sell it. But some have wondered if maybe John changed his mind and wanted to stay, and that led to a big dispute over the money to be made from that sale. Again, though, we really don't have any way of knowing. Truth is, I'd have no problem running with this theory if any evidence could be presented, but there isn't any. No one saw her doing anything untoward. The shotgun was never identified and apparently didn't have any legible prints on it, and there's no statements about her or her family having issues with John. Certainly nothing that would lead to violence. So, when you cut out both wives and the one son, you move on to sounder theories with at least a little more credibility. One theory that has, at different points in time, maintained some level of prominence in this case is the idea of a jealous husband or boyfriend. We know John was married to Rita for 13 years and then left her, and inside of a year was married with a son on the way. Some have wondered if John, a bigger and decent-looking fellow, might have been somewhat of a womanizer. He drives around a lot for work, finds himself alone with people from time to time, and they've theorized that maybe he had a woman or two he could have been fooling around with on the side who weren't exactly single. It doesn't take a doctorate to know that messing with someone's significant other is really dipping a toe across a line, and you could be taking your life into your own hands. That's something I could absolutely believe. I could see a man angry and frustrated stalking John. He heads over there that night, maybe to confront him, and he sees the wife and the baby. He doesn't want to involve them or harm them, so he lights the truck on fire to draw John outside, and when he gets his chance, he pulls the trigger. No major conspiracy, no complex plan, just a simple idea of gunning down the competition and disappearing into the night. I've always wondered, why did the killer leave the shotgun behind? Now, folks were coming out of the house drawn to the fire, and maybe he decided running down the street with a gun sticking out of his shirt would be a bad idea, and he was probably right. But there's another possibility that's been proffered over the years. What if the killer left the gun there because after firing that fatal blast, he walked around the corner, came stumbling up the driveway, and blended in with the rest of the neighbors and witnesses who showed up to fight the fire and talk to the police that night? It's not out of the realm of possibility that John could have been killed by a neighbor, maybe even someone who he thought was a friend. Motive notwithstanding, we just have no way of knowing that with any certainty. I've even heard that the killer might have been connected to law enforcement, and that perhaps they used that shotgun and wiped it down because they knew it was almost impossible to trace. Hard to say for sure, but you never know. And then it's not that complicated to walk up in your uniform and join the others who have gathered for the fire. The final two theories in this case revolve around John's murder being a case of retribution. First, there's the drug dealer theory. We get these statements from police officers that John may have been involved in drug trafficking. Where this comes from, how he was involved, to what level, no one seems to know. Was he dealing pot to teenagers, or was he smuggling in bricks of marijuana? Again, no one has any answers. The only solid connection we get between John and drugs is that police find a small amount of marijuana in his house. Not to be a jerk about it, but it was 1975. I imagine you could have found a small amount of pot in a hell of a lot of houses, but that doesn't mean the guy was some big-time drug runner. If he was, or if he were connected, you would think cops in the area, and especially cops up in Jacksonville, would have at least heard his name before. He'd have been on somebody's radar, but that doesn't appear to have happened here. Now, it's certainly not out of the realm of possibility for people connected to illegal drug running to get murdered, and it doesn't necessarily take much to end up on a violent killer's bad side. With John, though, we have nothing to make that connection. He was never arrested for anything drug-related. No one came forward to claim they'd seen him with drugs, and apparently, even if he were connected, no one told police any other names or places to look for people who may have wanted to harm him. Part of me also believes if this were drug-related, he'd have ended up shot somewhere in the middle of nowhere, or he'd have just disappeared. I suppose they could have come to his home to kill him, but if that were the case, I'd almost expect a more professional job, for lack of a better term. All I can say is if I were going out to kill someone, I wouldn't be packing a bolt-action single-barrel 20-gauge shotgun. But maybe they were a terrible shot, and that's the best gun they could get their hands on. Drug-related? Maybe. But you'd think over the years people would talk. You'd run someone in for possession, maybe enough to give them a good stretch in prison, and they might share some details about the unsolved homicide to shave a few years off. But that never happens, which either means a lot of people are keeping secrets, or this really is one hell of a mystery. Finally, we move towards the theory that's gotten the most push over the years, that John was ambushed and killed by one or more members of a local union that had enough of him taking what they felt were contracts that belonged to them. I don't think it's necessary for me to go diving into newspaper archives to tell you about all the union-related violence happening in the area at the time. Over the course of 10 to 15 years, there were constant fires, bombings, shootings, and other crimes pulled off both by members of local unions and by folks who work for non-union businesses. I'd say if these folks take it seriously enough to bomb cars, burn dozens of trucks, and even set a massive fire at a utility company, they aren't going to be all that shy about doing what they need to do to get you out of their way. These guys were ready to bomb the president of an air conditioning company because he was non-union. I don't think they'd hesitate to shoot John in his driveway. If what we're told is true, he ran into trouble back in Jacksonville when it came to the unions. He took jobs, picked up contracts, and worked for non-union companies, and they weren't happy about it. According to Vicky, he told her that he believed they were out to get him, and that may have been part of the reason he was so eager to head down to Claremont. There, he could start over, and he does, opening up Mango Refrigeration and picking up a ton of contracts. He starts introducing himself to people as John Mango, something police can't understand. Sure, he could have used a pseudonym to conduct illegal activities, or maybe he was worried that unions up in Jacksonville were in contact with unions down in Claremont, and he didn't want them to know who he was. We know that John was pressured and even threatened in Jacksonville. He was down in Claremont for a little less than a year when he was killed, and he was doing the same things there. He was working non-union jobs with non-union companies and picking up contracts with the city, which had to piss off those union folks. Reportedly, just weeks before the murder, he grabbed up a few new contracts which were described as lucrative and had been expected to go to the unions. So that right there may have been the moment he signed his own death warrant. John was a bigger-sized guy, not easily intimidated, and unfortunately, he may not have taken the warning seriously. The sheer fact that this all starts with his truck being set on fire makes me feel like it's connected to the unions again. Fire is one of their most common practices. So maybe they don't want to kill the wife and baby, so they don't set a bomb. Someone hides in the bushes, waits for John to come outside, and then fires a single shotgun blast right into his upper chest, and he dies within minutes. The gun is left behind, the killer vanishes into the night, and nearly 50 years later, they're no closer to solving the case than they were that warm spring night in March of 1975. It's a hell of a mystery. Perhaps Special Agent McMahon was right, and the difficulty of solving this case on a scale of 1 to 10 is as close to a 10 as it can be. But it's not a brilliant crime. It's not something cooked up by some evil genius who always finds a way to thwart law enforcement. It's a sneak attack, an ambush. A killer arrives at the home and finds it empty. He cuts the phone lines and then squeezes himself into a thick bush. He watches as John pulls up the driveway and walks inside with his wife and child. He doesn't shoot him then. Maybe he doesn't want to harm the wife, or he doesn't want her to see him. Moments later, he lures John outside with the vehicle fire and then lines him up and pulls the trigger. It's cold-blooded. It's premeditated. But it's not a work of genius. It's not a perfect crime. Unfortunately, investigators aren't perfect either. And all these years later, John's killer remains unknown, as does the reason, if one even exists. John Warren Harden was shot to death on the night of Saturday, March 22nd, 1975. He was 32 years old at the time, and if alive today, he would currently be 81. We don't know much about John's life, but we do know he mattered to his children, to his wife, and even to his ex-wife. He wasn't perfect, no one is, but he also didn't deserve the ending he was given. Shot down in his own driveway in the nude, trying to put out a fire that was used to lure him into the kill zone. For nearly half a century, those with knowledge of this case have kept it to themselves. Maybe after all this time, someone might be willing to share what they know, because without new information, new evidence, or an outright confession, the murder of John Harden will remain open, unsolved, and ice cold. If you're looking for more information on the murder of John Harden, there are many websites and forums discussing his case. For this episode, the Orlando Sentinel and Tampa Tribune were the most helpful. If you have any information about the murder of John Harden, please contact the Claremont Police Department at 352-394-5588. You can also contact the Florida Department of Law Enforcement at 1-855-FLA-SAFE. That's 1-855-352-7233. You can also contact Crime Stoppers at 1-800-423-TIPS. That's 1-800-423-8477. And you can report information anonymously on their website at crimeline.org. What do you believe happened? Tweet me at traceevpod, email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com, or comment in the Facebook group. Just a quick reminder, if you're planning to attend CrimeCon this year in Nashville from May 31st through June 2nd, use promo code TRACE at crimecon.com to save 10% on your pass. That's promo code TRACE at crimecon.com. Now, I'd like to take a moment to thank our amazing Patreon producers, without whom Trace Evidence would not be possible. A massive thank you to Andrew Guarino, Ann M. Bertram, Camelia Tyler, Christine Greco, Danny Renee, Denise Dingsdale, Desiree Lauro, Donna Buttram, Deani Dyson, Jennifer Winkler, Justin Snyder, Kara Moreland, K.Y., Lars Jensen Fangel, Leslie B., Lisa Hobson, Madison Lahoulier, Melissa Breckeisen, Nick Mohar Schurz, Roberta Jansen, Ruth, Stacy Finnegan, Stephanie Joyner, Tom Radford, and Wend Organ. I want to thank you all so much for your support. It means the world to me, and you are truly the lifeblood of this podcast. If you're interested in supporting the show and listening to your episodes ad-free, please visit patreon.com/traceevidence or click the support option on the official website at trace-evidence.com. This concludes our coverage in the murder of John Harden, a very solvable case that has only grown cold because those who know the truth refuse to share it. I want to thank you all again for listening, and I hope you'll join me next week for another unsolved case on the next episode of Trace Evidence.